October 29th, 2025. The Pacific Ocean, just 15 nautical miles off the coast of Oahu. The water is calm, but the radio waves are screaming. Sitting just outside the legal boundary of U.S. territorial waters is the Kareliya, a Russian spy ship that looks like it sailed straight out of a Cold War history book and into the modern day. Its deck is bristling with antennas. Its hull is coated in layers of gray paint meant to hide 40 years of rust, and its mission is simple: park on America's front porch and listen. The captain of the Kareliya likely felt a surge of arrogant pride. He was projecting Russian power, standing toe-to-toe with the USNavy, ready to scoop up sensitive military frequencies like a vacuum cleaner. But he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought this was a show of force. He thought the Americans would panic, scramble a carrier group, or issue frantic diplomatic protests. Instead, he was walking into a trap so sophisticated, so quiet, and so humiliating that it would rewrite the rule book on naval espionage. The U.S. military didn't send a fleet to destroy him. They didn't fire a single shot. They did something far worse. They turned his own mission against him, transforming a Russian intelligence operation into the most embarrassing live-fire tutorial of the 21st century. And by the time the Kareliya realized what was happening, it was already too late to pull the plug. To understand why this mission failed so spectacularly, you first have to understand the machine at the center of it. The Kareliya is a Vyshnya-class intelligence ship, originally built in Poland back in 1986. Moscow claims the ship was modernized in 2017, but anyone familiar with Russian naval procurement knows that modernization is often a code word for a fresh coat of paint and some commercial electronics bolted to the bridge. Underneath the surface, this vessel is a relic. Inside the steel hull, 146 sailors are crammed into spaces that smell of diesel fumes, cabbage, and sweat, chugging along at a top speed of just 16 knots. To put that in perspective, a modern container ship could leave it in the dust. But the crew on board wasn't there for a race. They were there for the antennas. The ship is essentially a floating ear designed to intercept communications, track radar signatures, and map the electronic order of battle of its adversaries. The captain, standing on the bridge, likely looked at the silhouette of Hawaii on the horizon and felt invincible. In his mind, he was the hunter. He believed that simply by being there, he was winning a psychological victory against the West. It's the kind of unearned confidence you see in a gambler who thinks he can beat the house just because he showed up to the casino. He was operating under an outdated doctrine, the idea that physical presence equals power. He assumed that the Americans would be reactive, clumsy, and loud. He expected a confrontation. What he got instead was a masterclass in modern asymmetric warfare. While he was busy looking at his antennas and dreaming of promotions, the Joint Operations Center at Indo-PACOM was already awake. They didn't panic. The watch commander simply glanced at a screen, picked up a secure line, and initiated a protocol that would turn the Kareliya from a hunter into a lab rat. The American response didn't begin with a warship. It began on a runway at Barber's Point with the roar of 4 massive turboprop engines. 18 minutes after the Kareliya was flagged, an HC-130J Super Hercules clawed its way into the sky. To the untrained eye, the Hercules looks like a cargo plane, a blue-collar truck of the sky that has been hauling jeeps and pallets since the 1950s. But this specific airframe was different. This wasn't a transport. It was a flying surveillance laboratory, capable of loitering in the air for 15 hours straight. The Hercules climbed to 2,000 feet and established a lazy orbit above the Russian ship. It didn't buzz the tower or try to scare the Russians. It simply circled, detached and clinical. Bolted to the fuselage of the aircraft was the real weapon, the AN/AAS-52 multispectral targeting system. That is a boring military name for a piece of technology that borders on science fiction. It is a gyro-stabilized camera pod that can filter through visual, infrared, and thermal spectrums. The stabilization is so precise that even with the aircraft vibrating and banking in the wind, the video feed remains perfectly still, as if the camera were mounted on a concrete tripod. From the deck of the Kareliya, the plane was just a distant drone, a buzzing fly in the sky. The Russian crew probably logged it and went back to work, assuming they were just being watched. They were wrong. They weren't just being watched, they were being dissected. The American crew wasn't looking at the ship, they were looking into it. The camera was powerful enough to zoom in and read the maintenance stickers on the Russian radar domes. They were building a real-time, three-dimensional intelligence model of the vessel, logging every crew rotation, every open hatch, and every piece of deck equipment. The Russians thought they were collecting data on Pearl Harbor. In reality, the U.S. Coast Guard was conducting a free, high-definition audit of Russia's premier spy ship. But the aerial surveillance was just the setup. The knockout blow was still steaming out of the harbor. While the Hercules kept its distance, the water began to churn back in Honolulu. The USCGC William Hart slipped its moorings and headed for open water. This vessel is a Sentinel-class fast-response cutter, and it represents a completely different philosophy of naval design. At 154 feet long, it is barely half the size of the Russian spy ship, but it is generations ahead in every metric that matters. Powered by twin MTU diesel engines pushing almost 6,000 horsepower through water jets, the Hart doesn't plow through the ocean, it skips across it. In less than an hour, the cutter was on the scene. This is where the math started to turn against the Russian captain. His 1980s hull was designed for stability in the North Sea, topping out at a sluggish 16 knots. The Hart, meanwhile, could maintain 28 knots all day long without even straining its engines. The tactical reality was brutal. The Russian ship couldn't run, it couldn't hide, and it couldn't maneuver. The American cutter executed a high-speed intercept, carving a tight turn that would have capsized the older Russian vessel, and settled into a perfect escort position just 500 yards off the Kareliya's port beam. There were no radio hails, no demands to leave, no aggressive posturing. The maneuver itself was the message. It was a physical demonstration of dominance. By matching the Russian ship's course and speed so effortlessly, the Hart was saying, "I am here, you are slow, and you are going exactly where I let you go." For the first time that day, the arrogance on the Russian bridge likely evaporated. The captain realized he wasn't in a spy movie anymore. He was in a cage. Pinned between the aircraft above and the cutter beside him, he felt the pressure mounting. And that pressure forced him to make a desperate, critical error. Cornered and exposed, the Russian captain tried to salvage the mission. If he couldn't outrun the Americans, he would do what he came there to do: collect intelligence. He gave the order to begin collection. On the bridge of the Kareliya, the SIGINT crew swung into action. Consoles lit up, cooling fans whirred to life, and the ship began to blast active radar waves and scan for frequencies. They thought they were hunting. They had no idea they were the prey. First, they activated the MR-231 navigation radar, sending out a broad, powerful pulse to map the surface vessels around them. Up in the Hercules, the American sensors instantly detected the emission. But they didn't just see a blip on a screen. The computer analyzed the specific waveform, the pulse repetition frequency, and the signal strength. It recognized the electronic fingerprint immediately. The system logged a perfect digital copy of the radar signature. One system compromised. Next, the Russians tried to listen in on naval communications, sweeping across the high-frequency bands. The moment their receivers went active, the American aircraft flagged the activity. The U.S. systems didn't just detect the sweep, They cross-referenced the encryption protocols the Russians were using. It was the electronic equivalent of watching a burglar try to pick a lock only to realize he's using a toolkit from 1985. The Americans now knew exactly what frequencies the Russians were listening to and, more importantly, what they couldn't hear. Two systems compromised. Finally, in a burst of frustration, the Russians likely activated their most sensitive gear, specialized receivers designed to detect American stealth aircraft. But here is the catch with active electronics. To be sensitive, they often have to emit a tiny calibration pulse. To the Hercules, that whisper was a scream. The American computers locked onto it, categorized it, and stored it. In less than 10 minutes, the Russians hadn't gathered a single byte of useful intel on the U.S. Navy. Instead, they had voluntarily broadcasted the complete electronic schematic of their own ship. They handed the keys to the kingdom to the U.S. Coast Guard, and they didn't even know they had been robbed. The engagement didn't end with an explosion, but with a whimper. After hours of being electronically strip-searched, the Kareliya simply gave up. The mission was a bust. The captain ordered the helm to come about, and the massive, lumbering ship turned its bow north, away from Hawaii, away from the sensitive cables, and away from its objective. It was the naval equivalent of a walk of shame. The USCGC William Hart didn't leave immediately. It stayed right there on their flank, escorting them like a bouncer walking a drunk patron out of a bar. They maintained visual contact, not because they had to, but out of principle. It was a final, silent confirmation of who held the reins. As the Russian ship chugged slowly toward the horizon, trailing black smoke, the American crew watched from the deck. They hadn't fired a shot. They hadn't put a single sailor in harm's way. Yet they had completely dismantled a strategic operation by a hostile foreign power. Back in Moscow, the state media was likely already spinning the narrative. They would call it a successful, routine exercise in international waters. They would claim the ship tested its systems and projected strength. But propaganda cannot hide the math. And when you look at the numbers of this encounter, the level of failure is breathtaking. Let's break down the brutal arithmetic of this mission. Russia invested heavily in this. A 10,000-mile round trip takes weeks. They burned hundreds of tons of fuel in engines that are notoriously inefficient. They paid for the supplies to feed 146 sailors for months. They put wear and tear on a hull that is already falling apart. The total cost of this operation, conservatively, runs well over $500,000. And what was the return on that investment? Zero. Zilch. In fact, it was negative. They returned home with no new intel, while simultaneously giving the U.S. Navy a fresh update on their own electronic vulnerabilities. Now look at the American investment. A few hours of flight time for a Hercules, an airframe that is cheap to fly and maintain. A few tanks of diesel for a cutter that was going to be on patrol anyway. The total cost for the U.S. response was likely south of $70,000. For the price of a luxury car, the U.S. military obtained a complete real-time intelligence package on a Russian naval asset. It wasn't just a victory, it was a transaction, a devastatingly lopsided transaction. The lesson of October 29th isn't just about one ship or one cutter. It's about the reality of modern geopolitical conflict. Russia sent the Kareliya to the Pacific to send a message. They wanted to show the world, and specifically China and North Korea, that they are still a global player. They wanted to prove that they can still reach out and touch American soil. But the message they actually sent was the opposite. Instead of demonstrating reach, they demonstrated vulnerability. Instead of gathering intelligence, they provided it. Every ally in the Pacific, Japan, South Korea, Australia, saw exactly what happened. They saw that the U.S. didn't need a carrier strike group to handle Russia. A Coast Guard plane and a single patrol boat were enough to neutralize the threat. Inside the briefing rooms of the PLA Navy in China, analysts were certainly taking notes. But they weren't noting Russian strength, they were noting American competence. The kind of competence that doesn't need to scream to make a point. The Kareliya sailed home with its hard drives full of noise and its reputation in tatters, proving that in the 21st century, the ocean is transparent, and if you aren't careful, the hunter can become the hunted in the blink of an eye.